Logbait. If you watch any Clash Royale YouTuber, you probably see Logbait decks being played pretty often. Logbait is an iconic archetype that has almost always been a part of the Clash Royale meta in some form since its inception. The concept is pretty simple. You use multiple cards that each get countered by a log. Get the opponent to use their log on one of them to allow the other loggable cards to do great damage without fear of the fallen Shrunk. If you can't get through, just cycle spells. Of course, Logbait wouldn't be called Logbait without the log. A card so powerful, so versatile, and so nerf-proof that it has certainly done its part to keep the Logbait archetype alive and well in the modern Clash Royale climate. There are so many variations of Logbait today, it's extremely unlikely that it will ever truly die out, even in the unlikely scenario that the log is nerfed to oblivion. So let's explore the past of this archetype to see its journey, its ups and downs, and talk about the reasoning behind why the log, despite having one of the, if not the highest usage rate in the game consistently for over 6 years, still doesn't receive a proper nerf, despite other cards that have had similar rates getting emergency nerfed within days. To begin this story, we need to go all the way back to Clash Royale's first year, 2016. The year is 2016. There's no such thing as Clan Wars, Mega Knight, or Diamond Pass Royales. The meta of this era is certainly vastly different from what we have today. One very important thing to note is that rather than the 5 2-elixir spells that we have today, there was only one during this era. The Zap was generally considered to be the most versatile and powerful card in the game, having no competition, and being significantly stronger than the Zap we see today. Additionally, the Princess was a very powerful legendary throughout 2016, being difficult to counter due to its long range and lack of spells to counter it with. So on July 4th, 2016, both of these problems would be attempted to be fixed, with a new legendary card, the Log, added to provide Zap with competition and be a hard counter to the Princess for a positive elixir trade. At first, the Log was considered to be an awful card. It was slow, couldn't knock back a lot of troops, and the range was very limiting. It was the only spell in Clash Royale that couldn't be played anywhere in the arena. The Zap outclassed it in almost every way, except for being able to take out a Princess, of course. So despite the Log's launch, the Zap was still a must-have card for most players, and I'm not exaggerating the popularity whatsoever. In August 2016, the Zap appeared in a whopping 98% of top ladder decks, with the Log appearing in 0. 98% is just unthinkably high and could never happen again today. But when you have a card that is appearing in nearly every match, the meta is just built around that card. Inferno Tower, Skeleton Army, and Sparky were nowhere to be seen in this environment, unsurprisingly, since Zap is so good at keeping these cards in check. Ultimately, it led to some Zap-bait decks being played, but nothing mainstream meta. Even though Zap essentially controlled the meta, none of the zappable cards were high pressure enough to make it a successful archetype. Now, one problem with the Log is that the only card that it countered better than the Zap was the Princess, which was popular, but it was nothing compared to the number of cards Zap could counter for an equal or even positive elixir trade. So despite a Zap nerf and Log buffs in the coming months, the Zap was still dominant over the Log. It was going to take more than just a couple of buffs or nerfs to ensure both of these cards could compete with one another while both maintaining healthy use and win rates. By the start of 2017, Zap was being used immensely more than the Log, despite the buffs the Log had received. And just to compare, this version of the Log compared to today's Log is objectively superior stat-wise, dealing more damage, having more range, and pushing troops much further. But this modern inferior version of the Log reigns supreme, being not only the most popular spell, but the most popular card in the game by double digits. In January 2017, you were already seeing a spell-bait deck becoming the second most popular deck in the competitive scene thanks to the new powerful Log. Out of the top 5 decks at this time, Log may have been in the second most popular one, but Zap was in the number 1 most popular deck and the 3rd to 5th. Although the Log was certainly seeing usage around this time, it simply couldn't live up to the power of the Zap. What made Zap so popular even with the Log in its strongest state ever? The biggest problem was just purpose. Log was so versatile, being useful in many scenarios, but Zap just did everything much faster. It was instant. It did almost everything a Log would be expected to do, but better, except of course, killing Princess. That's one of the reasons it was added in the first place. So Clash Royale's first card of 2017 would be the Dark Goblin, a card strong enough to survive a Zap, but fragile enough to fold to the spiky trunk. With another card in this category, it finally gave the Log a bit more purpose, but it wasn't enough. By the end of January, balance changes would arrive, nerfing the Zap's damage by 6%, a nerf that may seem rather small and insignificant at first glance, but this was devastating to the card as it stripped the Zap's ability to kill goblins, a troop prominent in 2 different cards. This made a considerable amount of people ditch the Zap, and as a result, the Goblin Barrel shot up in popularity. Its previous hardest counter was no longer longer effective. This led to a chain effect to where the log shot up in popularity, now solidifying its spot as the most popular spell, which meant we were really starting to see some crazy Logbait decks appear in top ladder. But it wouldn't be until one final major thing happened around this time until Spellbait would solidify itself as a mainstream archetype, the last spark that would change the game forever. On February 24th, 2017, the Goblin Gang would be added to Clash Royale, a card that may have just been a filler card initially since it was literally just 2 cards put together, but perhaps one of the most game-changing cards in the game's entire history. Since the Stab Goblins would not die to Zap, this was yet another card that would make Zap players wish they had packaged a log instead. To play the 2 cards that made up this card separately, it would cost 4 elixir, but since this card, which combined to the 2 Goblin cards, was only 3 elixir, it allowed for a lot of extra value if you could utilize the power of all 6 goblins. Just one day after this card was released, an iconic video would be uploaded to YouTube simply titled Goblin Gang Logbait. This was the earliest video of the most iconic Logbait deck in all of Clash Royale history. The only difference is soon after this video, it was realized that the Ice Spirit was a better fit than the Fire Spirits. But other than that, this is the earliest mainstream iteration of Logbait. This deck truly was a completely different way of playing Clash Royale than was ever intended. The Goblin Barrel was sort of a win condition and was considered the win condition in this deck, but since for the majority of its lifetime it was hard countered by a card that everyone and their grandmother was playing, it couldn't ever really be relied upon before. Even though you could pretty much always expect a log from your opponent, all you had to do was bait it out with a princess or a goblin gang to practically guarantee value from the barrel. If they save the log for the goblin barrel, then you can get insane value on your gang and princess. By the beginning of March, Classic Logbait was still a fairly niche deck, being popular and viable, but certainly not mainstream yet. 2 other variations actually shot up in popularity. This Hog Rider deck was actually the most popular variation of the Hog Rider and Logbait archetypes, being the 2nd most popular deck in top ladder in March 2017. It's good to know that the Hog Rider was generally overpowered for most of 2016 and 2017, so it found its way into practically every archetype at some point. By June, Hog Rider was fizzling out of Logbait, as Classic Logbait was going strong, with even Dark Goblin finding some spotlight. However, by June 2017, Classic Logbait would take a hit with a nerf to the Goblin Gang, losing one of its Spear Goblins. But even with that, Classic Logbait became the superior version by July, being the 3rd most popular deck in the game overall. But with continued developing strategy and a few other factors, Logbait exploded to becoming the #1 most popular deck in the entire game, nearly tripling its usage rate between the July and August seasons. So what happened? Well, during this same month as Logbait exploded, the bats had received a major buff, making them extremely popular. Because of this, the Zap made its way to being the most popular card in the game once again, naturally causing the log to fall. Bats were defining the meta, raising the demand for Zap immensely, but with so many fewer people playing log to counter princesses and goblin barrels, these cards would thrive. The Inferno Tower also had a much higher use rate than the previous month. This was due at least in part to a new very strong card that was released during this season, the Mega Knight. I should also mention that the 20-win challenge was also this month, which is a yearly challenge that causes rapid meta shifts to occur. Logbait just fell into the perfect environment it needed to thrive. This era was the peak of Logbait, remaining as the #1 most popular deck for 3 months straight. During this period, you actually saw a lot of people beginning to switch out Inferno Tower for Tornado. Tornado was just more versatile. Since you were seeing a lot more Expo and 3 Musketeers now, the Inferno Tower was just not always a reliable choice. The Tesla also got a rework during this golden age and then began competing the Tornado and Inferno Tower for that slot. But as I said, this deck was trending as the #1 deck for 3 straight months, which is something that Supercell could not ignore. Although no card in this deck was inherently super strong, except for perhaps the log, it was undoubtedly stronger than Supercell would want a deck to be. So when the December balance changes rolled around, Supercell would decide to nerf not just 1, not 2, but 6 of the 8 cards in Logbait in just a single balance change. Spells would now do less damage to crown towers, making cycling them less effective. Goblins would also do less damage, and the knight would hit slower. The Inferno Tower would also now reset when it broke the shield of a shielded true. However, despite all these nerfs, Logbait would only drop to being the 2nd most used deck in top ladder, and perhaps it would have actually stayed at #1 if it wasn't for one other major thing that would happen this month. This same month, the Royal Ghost would be released, which was a meta-defining card. So for the December 2017 season, a Royal Ghost deck took the #1 spot. But Logbait continued to dwindle in popularity, and by the January 2018 season, the Inferno Tower variant of classic Logbait was nowhere to be seen in the top 200. The Inferno Tower was entirely replaced by the Tornado variant. In February, there was actually another set of balance changes that would hurt Logbait even further, nerfing the Knight's health by 6%. The Dark Prince would also receive a pretty generous buff, making it spike in popularity, therefore hurting the Goblin Gang. Logbait would fall to only becoming the 10th most popular deck in top ladder, and the Knight would not be used in Logbait at all anymore, instead being replaced with the Valkyrie. This was also partially because the Valkyrie got a buff in February as well. Surprisingly, the Inferno Tower was being used again a little bit, even with the Tornado variant still being popular. It was a very diverse meta. Beatdown was very popular this season, which allowed the Inferno Tower to be a good answer to tanks, but with the December nerf, it sucked against the newly popular Dark Prince. With so much diversity in the meta, the Inferno Tower, Tesla, and Tornado variants were all being seen. Dark Prince wasn't the only shielded troop to be popular during this season either, as the Guard surprisingly saw a massive uptick in popularity during this season as well. By March 2018, Logbait was nowhere to be seen in top ladder. The meta at this point was just so Prince and bridge spam oriented now, it was just impossible to defend these high tempo pushes with just a single tower and some swarms. However, just because classic Logbait was rare in top ladder and not being used much in challenges anymore, does not mean the archetype was dead. Since Princes were everywhere during this period, it found its way into the Logbait archetype as well. If you can't beat them, join them. These two Logbait decks with Prince and Dark Prince became fairly popular throughout March in challenges. I even found a giant skeleton deck that wasn't quite as popular as the Prince decks, but it was still winning 65% of its matches in the time frame where data was available for it, so I thought I'd at least briefly mention it. The prominence of classic Logbait was still low the following month in April. It was still a very beatdown bridge spammy meta, meaning there wasn't a lot of room for Logbait to thrive without one of the Princes. The integration of Prince into Logbait was really telling of how flexible and adaptive Logbait could be. And the adaptation certainly wasn't over, as right around this time another major development to Logbait would occur completely unrelated to the Princes. In May, the Rascals would be released, and the Rascal Girl troop is a troop that would die to Log, thus naturally finding its way into some variants of Logbait almost immediately. There actually was a brief period of the Rascals being in the game before the Prince got nerfed, so you saw some variants of Rascal Bait pop up during this time containing the Prince. However, despite this nerf it got by June, the Prince actually still appeared in some variants of Logbait afterwards, cementing its place as a viable variant of the archetype for years to come. In the same month as the Prince nerf though, the Valkyrie would actually get two buffs, one of them being a major detriment for Logbait players. It would get a first hit speed buff from 0.2 seconds to 0.0 seconds. This first hit speed buff allowed the Valkyrie to fully counter a Goblin Barrel, and this buff made the Valkyrie generally extremely strong, thus it was everywhere, which was not good for Logbait players. People did still continue to play Logbait, integrating the Valkyrie, which completely replaced the classic Knight variant during this era. The Tesla was also very strong during this period, so up until August 2018, it was definitely the primary building choice at this time. And there would be one more development to the archetype in 2018. For this era of Clash Royale, players could vote on which cards they wanted to see in the balance changes, and for November 2018, Dark Goblin was voted by the players to receive a 4% damage buff. No major interactions came of this, but it undoubtedly made it go from underused to popular. It was mainly appearing in a new form of bait that I have yet to talk about, Mortar Bait. Mortar Swarm and Cycle decks have been fairly popular for a few months now already, but when the Dark Goblin got buffed and started appearing in Mortar Bait, I felt more comfortable calling these decks a form of Logbait, since I don't just want to call any deck with the Goblin Gang in it a Logbait deck. 3 months later, in February 2019, the Dark Goblin would get nerfed and Mortar Bait decks became more niche. Going into 2019, you would still see the classic version, Tornado variant, Tesla variant, Valkyrie variant, Prince variant, Mortar Bait, and Rascal Bait. There were so many viable variants by now. Logbait was going to continue to thrive and adapt as long as spells held the place in the game that they did, especially the Log. Also, just so you know, the Log's new main competitor was no longer the Zap, but the Barbarian Barrel, which was thriving. The Log and Barrel had a use rate of 74% combined in grand challenges. Spells are able to keep so many cards in check, and it was just clear by this point, no matter how you played Clash Royale, you were just trying to bait out your opponent's spells, even if you weren't playing a Logbait deck. Spells were all just really strong, having much higher use rates than most troop cards would ever be allowed to have. There were really no developments in 2019, but 2020 2020 had a few small ones. One was that all spells got another Crown Tower reduction nerf in August 2020, but these spells were still far from underpowered. Rascal Bait and the Tornado variants of Bait were also dying out. Rascals were not great anymore and were falling out of the meta entirely. Tornado was still viable, but it got reworked to the point where it didn't fulfill the purpose it needed to in Logbait anymore. The last development was the formation of a new form of Logbait with the Skeleton Barrel. This deck got very popular in late 2020 and continued to thrive into 2021. It was pretty incredible. As new variants of Logbait arrived, most of the older variants would still see at least some play, with maybe some brief absences for a month or two here or there. Logbait was simply unnerfable. It had so many variants and was always able to adapt to the meta so well, which is why later in 2021, it would surprise many people when one major event would occur that would bring the entire Logbait archetype to its knees. In June 2021, Clash Royale would get its summer update, which would come with a game-changing set of balance changes. Particularly, just one balance change would completely flip the archetype's power overnight. This downfall would be thanks to the Fire Spirits. Or should I now say, the Fire Spirit. The previous Fire Spirits card just never quite fit into Clash Royale well, so Supercell would be reworking this card into a single unit, making it similar to the other spirits. It would get a drastic increase in damage, hit points, and range to make up for the reduced count, but it would get one more change that was the sole cause of Logbait's downfall. Its damage range would be increased by 47%, which caused a huge interaction change that was likely unintentional. The Fire Spirit would now fully counter a Goblin Barrel even when placed directly on the tower. The damage radius was so big that no matter which Goblin it hit, it would always hit the other two as well. Tricky Barrels wouldn't even matter since the Fire Spirit wasn't a spell and would just follow wherever the Goblins were placed. You didn't even need good timing or placement in order to easily fully counter it, and since the Fire Spirit was only one elixir, the Fire Spirit user would get a 2 elixir advantage from the interaction. Since the Goblin Barrel was useless when the opponent had Fire Spirit, it was unreliable, thus causing the entire archetype to tank in win rates. Not to even mention Dark Prince was back in the meta stronger than ever, so if you were sticking to the Inferno Tower variant, you probably were not enjoying the game much around this time. The Fire Spirit wasn't exactly everywhere, so you could still succeed with Logbait if your opponent didn't have the Spirit, but you certainly couldn't reliably push with Logbait. Rascal Bait even made a little bit of a comeback because of the Rascal buff that came at the same time as the Fire Spirit rework. However, many prominent Logbait players agree that this was the worst era for Logbait in its entire history. In fact, not a single Logbait deck finished in the top 200 for 3 straight months. Despite all the variations there were, Logbait players just had no form of counterplay for this troublesome spirit. Finally, in September 2021, the Fire Spirit would get a damage radius nerf of 0.2 tiles, making Goblin Barrel a reliable card once again. However, in the same balance change, the Giant Snowball, the 4th damage-dealing 2 elixir spell, would get a knockback buff, allowing it to fully counter a Goblin Barrel with the assistance of the tower. Now, 3 of the 4 2 elixir damage-dealing spells were good against a solo Goblin Barrel. The very next month, Clash Royale would enter a new era. Champions would be added to the game, reshaping the meta forever, and this certainly had effects on the Logbait archetype. The Ice Spirit's win rate would fall below the other Logbait cards, and the Goblin Gang fell a lot in use and win rate. Despite not receiving a balance change in a year and a half, Goblin Gang just wasn't that useful in a champion-filled environment. By 2022, you were beginning to see multiple variants of Logbait replacing Ice Spirit and Goblin Gang with Guards and Electro Spirit. This was pretty crazy, as the Goblin Gang had always been considered a pretty decent card and a staple to the Logbait archetype, but the stats could no longer back up its perceived strength. The Ice Spirit got a buff in April to make up for its weakness. However, you would still often see the Electro Spirit variants after this buff. Goblin Gang was a little trickier though, as almost any change would affect other healthy cards, so it remained in a weak position for now. However, in the same balance change as this Ice Spirit buff, another major change would happen, completely warping the meta once again. The Mirror would now spawn cards 2 levels higher rather than just 1. Within a day, there was a trending Skeleton King Mirror bait deck, but Mirror and Logbait wouldn't be a mainstream combination for long, as even with the additional level, other bait decks were just found to work better. April was also around the time the brand new Mighty Miner card found its way into the bait archetype. The Mighty Miner was sort of a good combination of Inferno Tower and Knight. This deck became much more popular by June after the Mighty Miner got a few buffs, and this deck remained as a viable variant. That pretty much sums up the major developments of Logbait up until October 2022, where a huge balance change would be announced in regards to Logbait. The 6th Goblin from the Goblin Gang would return after being missing for over 5 years. Although 6 goblins may may have been a little too strong in 2017, the Goblin Gang in the 2022 environment clearly needed the extra support. The community rejoiced that the gang was back together, and Logbait's popularity naturally increased, but it wouldn't even be a full month later for everything to change once again. With the October update coming later that month, more balance changes would come with it, and the Goblin Troop would make an appearance. It was certainly a difficult situation because the Goblin Troop appeared in 4 cards now, and they were all in different positions in terms of power. However, with the weakest Goblin card getting a troop count buff, the troop itself would get a first hit speed nerf of 0.2 seconds. It's a bit hard to tell exactly how this change directly affected Logbait at first, because at the same time, the Phoenix and the Monk were added to Clash Royale, completely warping the meta overnight. All I can say for sure is Logbait certainly did not thrive in a Phoenix Monk controlled environment. And that's really all there is to say about that until the next set of balance changes in December, since the game was just Phoenix, Arizona for 5 weeks. In this set of balance changes, we would get 2 interesting changes. One was that the Rage spell would now deal damage, making it the 5th 2 elixir damage dealing spell. But the problem for Logbait players was that it would even one-shot goblins now, providing yet another hard counter to the Goblin Barrel. Luckily though, the Rage change was delayed to a later date and ultimately got a last-minute change to where it would actually not kill goblins after all, making it irrelevant for the rest of this video. The main change that would really impact Logbait was a Mighty Miner buff, going from medium to fast. As we already discussed earlier, Mighty Miner was a decent choice for Logbait, so after this change was implemented, multiple popular variations of Mighty Miner bait began to appear. The additional speed really allowed for that extra pressure that synergizes with Logbait. One other development that was happening around this time was that the Goblin Gang was being substituted for just the standard goblins now, as that extra 4th goblin for the cheaper cost was just huge value. The Mighty Miner buff was certainly a little too much, so it was emergency nerfed just a few weeks later. So now we could finally see how Logbait would fare without game-breaking cards controlling the meta. And it was definitely apparent that the first hit speed goblin nerf put the barrel in a super weak position, and the Goblin Gang was being boxed out by the goblins. The archetype had certainly seen better days, and it was only about to get worse. February 2023 would bring yet another set of balance changes that would affect Logbait. This time would be 2 direct nerfs, one to the Log and the other to the Rocket. Log had consistently been one of the most popular cards for 6 years straight, so a nerf was completely justified and long overdue. But the Rocket nerf was a bit of a surprise. The use and win rates would imply that it was about average in terms of strength, but it was extremely frustrating to go against. Thus, the community and especially pro players who have extra influence demanded a nerf. I don't think this nerf was a problem in itself, but I don't know why Supercell didn't also nerf the crown tower damage of the other big spells, since they had always been consistent with that in the past and they all had higher use and win rates than the Rocket before the nerf. Plus, the Log had already gotten a crown tower reduction nerf only a few months back, so at this point it just seemed like it made so much sense to simplify all of the spells to 20% crown tower damage. Supercell historically has always been more lenient with damage dealing spells, hesitantly nerfing them even with use rates much higher than the average card. This was definitely very apparent with the Log and can be used to explain how it continued to avoid nerfs despite its consistently high performance for years. Spells are just a type of card that are very reactive to the meta. If Magic Archer becomes meta, Fireball will become more popular. If the Witch becomes meta, Poison will become more popular. And with much less spell options than troops, they're naturally bound to have higher use rates without it feeling unhealthy for the game. That, and the community typically also doesn't complain about cheaper cards as much, and complaints definitely have a big part in driving what cards they balance. But spells are super versatile anyway, and they don't need to be. In my opinion, I think spells are still way too controlling. I think a standard reduction to at least 20% crown tower damage is more than reasonable with a further nerf to the Log. Log is really the only spell nowadays that feels proactive instead of reactive, hence why it's dominating the field of spells by a huge margin. The February 2023 Log nerf really only hurt the Log's power in decks like Logbait, because it was still just as effective at doing what it needed to do against Logbait, since cards like Goblins don't take knockback anyway. But since it would knock big troops less further back, it really only hurt the power against bigger cards, of which Logbait doesn't really have, unless you're playing a Prince variant. And at this point, the Rascals and Rascalbait were both completely dead. Logbait was in a terrible spot by now, and was likely in the worst position it had ever been in, except for that brief period of the Fire Spirit reign. Spell cycling was such a key part of this archetype, and that had been made much harder with the Rocket nerf. The only variant that seemed even somewhat viable was the Mighty Miner variant, which was obviously a modern variation. The older variants were practically dead in the competitive scene. The meta had shifted so much over the last 6 years since the original version was first assembled, but Logbait always finds a way. With the April 2023 balance changes, an old friend would soon return to help the dying archetype. Rascals had a really low use and win rate for a long time now, even being the least popular card in the entire game at one point. They clearly fell out of fashion and needed some help, so Supercell would give them 3 distinct buffs. Their first would be a health buff to the Rascal boy, then a first hit speed buff to the girls, and finally they would now be spawned further apart, resulting in less instances of the girls dying so quickly when going against splash troops. With these buffs, the Rascals were welcomed back into the Logbait archetype. This deck was actually being used by a top player successfully before the balance change went live, but after the balance change went live, it climbed to being the #1 most popular bait deck. This particular deck variant didn't remain popular for long though, so the main form of Logbait you'll see as of May 2023 is still Mighty Miner bait. Today there are quite a few popular variants of Mighty Miner bait, notably seeing other defensive buildings being used and much more lightning instead of rocket. Surprisingly, the OG classic version of Logbait is still being used just as often as some of these other versions of Mighty Miner bait, which is crazy considering this was a meta deck in 2017. The cards that are a part of this deck have received so many changes since then. And I didn't mention this, and it may have been implied, but it never at any point, at least through what I could find, stopped being a top Grand Challenge deck in any era since its inception. The classic version of Logbait is perhaps the most iconic deck in Clash Royale history next to Hog 2.6, and I'm sure no matter what happens to it, there's going to be hardcore players taking the uphill challenge and playing it anyway, and that's something to respect. Just please stop playing it in 7 times Elixir. As for the future of Logbait, I'm sure there will be plenty of new developments. I still think Supercell has some work to do on fixing the Goblin cards. I understand it's tricky. We got the 6th Goblin back in the gang after 5 years, so I wouldn't be surprised if we even saw impact damage back on the Goblin barrel to help separate it from the other Goblin cards. Maybe you could even give it reduced Crown Tower damage so that it maybe could even double as some sort of defensive spell. I'm sure Supercell is going through thousands of ideas, so we'll just have to see what they do. I know I didn't cover literally every little detail I could have in this video, but I tried to cover all the major points and the most popular Logbait decks in the history of Clash Royale. Certainly a lot of cards have been a part of this archetype at some point, and the archetype has always had an influence on the Clash Royale meta as long as it's been here. Who could have known that a card that was purely meant to help counter the princess and a filler card added to fill a quota could perhaps be the 2 most impactful cards in Clash Royale history?